We are beginning our series entitled Waypoint that we introduced last week, and we are going to be looking at over the next couple of months what church is all about. And this week we're going to start with what is the biblical basis for church. And to do that, we're going to turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 16, starting in verse 13. It says, "When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say the Son of Man is?' They replied, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' 'What about you?' he asked. 'Who do you say I am?' Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God.' Jesus replied, 'Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it.'" And we'll stop reading there, because that's as much as we're actually going to look at this week. We're going to look at some of the rest of this passage next week, but it's an important passage because this is where Jesus institutes this whole thing that we call church. And there are a few things that are worth noting in this passage. One is it's going to be important to look at the word that Jesus uses. He uses the word ecclesia, which in most English translations is translated church. And so that's where our word comes from, and it's a Greek word that is ecclesia. Now, interestingly, what we understand as church is a little bit different than what the Greek word ecclesia actually seemed to mean. And that we'll get into that because there's two words that are similar in Greek. One of them is ecclesia, and the other one is synagogue. And those are two important words, and we're going to look at both of them a little bit. Now, the word ecclesia means gathering or assembly. And that's literally what it means. And so Jesus is saying, I'm going to build my assembly. And we'll look at why he potentially uses that word. But the other word, synagogue, can also mean gathering, but they used the word synagogue a little differently. And actually, what we use the word church as, and how we're used to using the word church, actually resembles the word synagogue a lot more than it actually resembles the word ecclesia, which is kind of interesting, because the word synagogue could refer to a building or the people who gather in the building. And the synagogue was used as both a place of meeting together and doing worship and things together and reading the scriptures and prayer and that, but it was also used as a community center. It was used as a place where sometimes different groups would come in and use it, and it was a gathering point. So in a lot of ways, synagogue seems to be more what we've patterned what church looks like after, but it's not biblically what the word that we translate as church actually is. Every time the word synagogue is used, they generally just write synagogue, because we're separating it as this Jewish thing that the Jews had. They went to the synagogue, and in the early church we see Paul would go to the synagogue and preach there and talk to the Jews about who Jesus was, but they understood that always in this Jewish context. The word church is always the word ecclesia. Now, strangely, the word ecclesia isn't always translated church. There are a couple of instances where it clearly isn't referring to church in any way. It's just a gathering of people, such as in the book of Acts, when in chapter 19, during the riots at Ephesus, when Paul is there and he's been preaching and the people get upset and they approach him and they all gather against him, it refers to the whole assembly gathered to speak up against Paul. And the word the whole assembly there is ecclesia. But clearly it's not talking about a church meeting. It's talking about angry people who are upset with Paul and are So it gets left as assembly, not translated church, but it is strangely the same word. Now, another thing that's important to note is while the New Testament is written in Greek and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, about 300 years before Jesus, the Old Testament was translated into Greek. And by the time of Jesus' day, the Greek translation of the Old Testament was extremely common and actually read very regularly. So this understanding of the Greek words and people in the New Testament quoting the Old Testament in Greek is actually fairly common. And that's an important fact because the word ecclesia shows up a number of times in the Old Testament translation in Greek. And the most important and significant is in the encounter at Mount Sinai, in which the people come and they all gather and in front of the mountain, and God begins to speak to them. And in that point is in the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses recaps their whole journey, he talks about the assembly at Sinai. And as he talks about that, the translators used the word ecclesia. And that's an important thing because I think there's something directly related to that Jesus is doing here. So if we remember, and you can go back and look at our Exodus series if you want to refresh your memory on this, but when the people gathered at Sinai, God wanted to meet with them. God wanted to develop a personal relationship with them. And he really much wanted to join and have this thing that I will be your God and you will be my people. But the people got scared and they said, Moses, you go on up on the mountain, you talk to God, we'll stay down here and you can just come and tell us what he said. And that's the way the Sinai whole encounter goes, and you can go back and review that in our previous series about that and understand all of what that means. But it's a significant thing because what we see here in this passage, Jesus begins to talk about something new. And he says, I am going to build my own assembly. And by saying that, he says, I'm going to build my church, or I'm going to build my own assembly. And in doing that, he's saying, I'm going to build an assembly that is going to replace or fulfill the things that the old assembly of the Old Testament never did. And he sets that out, and you can see as he has this encounter with his disciples, and he says, who do you think I am? Or who do people say I am? And they start replying about what the gossip is. Some people say you're this, some people say you're that. And then he goes, but what about you? And Peter answers that you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, yes. But he says he's excited about it for a very specific reason. He says it's because you didn't figure this out yourself. Nobody told you, but you've heard this directly from the Father. And it's at that moment that he says, I am going to build a new assembly. I'm going to build a different assembly than the old one who needed Moses to act as an intermediary. He says this new assembly is going to be different. It's not going to require a leader like Moses who hears God and then just tells the people who don't have a direct relationship what God says. He says, no, I'm going to build a new assembly, one where people can hear from God directly. And that's a huge thing. And that's what I really believe is the biblical basis for this whole thing that we call church. It's Jesus building a group of people who don't require somebody to speak for God because they can hear God themselves. And as we look at a little more at this passage, there's something else that's significant about it. The original assembly, as we said, that met at Mount Sinai, they'd been called there. God brought them out of Egypt, and he brought them into the wilderness, to this secluded place, to a mountain that says, I'm going to speak to you here. where there's no distractions, there's nothing else. It's just you guys and me, and we can have this relationship. But where Jesus is, he's in a very interesting place. It says, if we look back at verse 13 here, it says, Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Now, Caesarea Philippi is an interesting place. It's not in the sort of classical boundaries of Israel. It's outside of that, and it's not in Galilee. It's not down in Judea. It's over on the eastern sort of side of the Sea of Galilee, and it's sort of over there, and it's a Roman town. Caesarea Philippi is very much a Roman settlement, and it's also the center of a lot of, well, occultic practices. It's the center of the worship of the Greek god Pan, and there is also a crack there that was known as the Gates of Hades, and a lot of people went there to engage in these spiritual activities. And that's important because what Jesus is saying is, I am going to institute something new. I'm going to gather an assembly. And you know what? You don't need to just be in a special, secluded place where it's just you and God to hear from God. You can hear from God in the midst of all the other stuff that goes on. Some of the more terrible practices of idolatry, of worship of other gods, and the debauchery that often goes along with these practices, in the midst of all that, you can still hear from the Father. Because that's where Peter got this revelation. Yes, he's sitting with Jesus while he's come to this conclusion, but they are not off in the wilderness in their own secluded place. They are in a spiritually turbulent spot. A place that, we might say, I don't know if you should go there. That's not great. But Jesus just wanders in. And in the midst of it, Peter can hear from the Father. And he says, that's going to be the hallmark of my new assembly, my church, this thing that I am building. It's going to be made up of people who can hear from God. And they don't need to go away to a special spot to hear from God. They don't need to seclude themselves. They don't need to cut themselves off from the world around them to hear from God. They can hear in the midst of some of the worst stuff that's going on. And that is massively encouraging. And he says, Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And he brings this in. So it's like, even if you don't know at the beginning what Caesarea Philippi is about, he draws out and he highlights this thing, this place called the gates of Hades, that's right there, potentially in view of where they're having this conversation. And he says, you know what? That stuff, all of the things that go with this wrong spirituality, he goes, that is not more powerful than what's going on with us. It's not going to win. It's not going to drown out your ability to hear from God. And sometimes we look at this passage and think it's all about spiritual warfare, and in one sense it is. But what he's saying, I think most importantly, is that your ability to hear from God doesn't get canceled out by what's going on around you. Your ability to hear from God is your ability to hear from God. And the more we spend time in God's presence, the better that ability becomes. Now, this story happens about halfway through the book of Matthew. Clearly, the disciples have been hanging out with Jesus for a while. So he didn't bring them to this place on day one and said, okay, who can hear from God? He's been working with them. He's been developing this. And they've been spending time with him. They've been learning about who Jesus is. They've been grasping more about who the Father is. And in that process, they get to this place where Peter can come out with this incredible revelation in a spiritually tumultuous place. And because of that, Jesus says, I can do something new. We don't have to stick with the old assembly that needs to hear from Moses, that needs to hear from a leader, that has one person who goes and has a relationship with God on behalf of an entire nation of people. He says, you know what? You all can do that. And what I want to do is gather myself an assembly of people who all hear from God. And that is what the foundation of church is. And everything that follows in our series is going to be related to the fact that church, first and foremost, is about a calling of people who can hear from God. Now, it doesn't mean we all always hear accurately and right away. It doesn't mean that we don't get things wrong. It doesn't mean that, oh, if you don't hear from God, you're not part of our group. And that's not what I want to talk about, but it's about the fact that overall, the people who identify themselves and say, you know what, I would call myself part of the church because I have a relationship with God. And that is the thing. Now, it doesn't mean in any way that we go, if you don't have a close relationship with God, you're out. It's not about drawing a line, but it's about Jesus saying, I am going to gather people. And the people who want to gather are the people who are hearing God's voice or on a journey towards that and want to know what it is. And he says the ultimate gathering point is him. Now, I love the fact that Jesus says, I will build my church. That's also important because a lot of the time we think it's our job to go out and build a church. Whether it's Amy's job as the pastor or the leadership's job or even the rest of us as members of the church, it's our job to go and build more of the church. And actually Jesus says no. I, Jesus, will build my church. That lets us off the hook. That doesn't mean we don't do work. It doesn't mean we aren't involved in a lot of things. It doesn't mean we don't go out and share who he is. But we're off the hook for the results because ultimately Jesus is the one who builds his church. We just need to be obedient to what he says and not worry about the results quite so much. And I think that's a freeing thing as well. And I think that's enough for this first week. We're going to continue this on. We're going to keep looking at what church is about over the next few months, but we're going to start off with this. Church is an assembly of people who can hear from God directly, who aren't like the nation of Israel that needed somebody to speak to God for them. We can do that ourselves, and because we can, we are church.